Text of Zhang Ailing's Young Chapter 10. Gu Gang went to the village office every day these 2 days to help write Spring Festival couplets. These are all prepared to be sold to farmers during the new year, and they will be distributed from house to house. Those from better families will be given a pair of 7-character ones, a pair of very poor people, and a pair of 5-character ones. Because the price has always been based on the number of characters. The most common sentence is "Long live Chairman Mao, may the Communist Party live forever." Although the contrast is also very neat, and the black and round characters are written on red paper or coral paper. It is still very pleasing to the eye, but it is different from the previous gathering. Comparing Fu Kiluan Land, Pile of Gold, and Jade Gate, and the like, they always seem to be different. The day Jinhua came back to her parents' home was a dark and snowy day. When she came, Gu Gang hadn't gone out yet, so everyone just sat there and chatted. As soon as Gu Gang left, she started complaining. She said that her mother-in-law treated her more politely because she was new here. But the sisters-in-law couldn't stand her and teamed up to say bad things about her. They said she was lazy and greedy, and that her husband would rather starve himself and save food for her. Her mother-in-law was very angry after hearing this and scolded her son for being useless. Jinhua said this was nothing. It is true that everyone is hungry. Yuxiang came back from Shanghai this time and brought a towel and a piece of soap for her, which caused a lot of gossip. Since then, the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law often asked her to go back to her parents' house to borrow money. This time her mother-in-law officially spoke to her and asked her to come back and borrow money. Otherwise they won't be able to celebrate the new year. Ban Chuo Ya Cha, Yuxiang said, if I had known it was so hard in the countryside, I would never buy those things to bring to you again. Instead, I would embarrass you. Jinhua continued to describe her pain in a monotonous voice. With no expression on her face, her eyes looking at the ground, and her hands folded under her cotton-padded jacket. The room was very cold, and there were often long silences as they all sat there motionless, blowing out white smoke. Ao Hongtao Nuo Xiansang's sister, Yuxiang comforted him and said, when you are in someone else's home, you naturally feel a little aggrieved, unlike when you are at your own home. When Jinhua heard this, she felt sad. She lowered her head, lifted up her clothes, and wiped her eyes. Wiping again and again, the tears seemed to flow endlessly. Chao Mei is haggard and crying, Yuxiang said. You are finally lucky. As long as your brother-in-law treats you well, you will always be able to survive in the future. Although the current situation is a bit bitter, it is not just your family, it is the same for every family. If you want to talk about what kind of life our family is living, others don't know. But you, sister, know? She began to describe the plight of her family. Jin Zhen didn't say a word. He also knew that Yuxiang would never be willing to take out the remaining savings. But he couldn't help but feel sad when he thought about being with his sister when he was a child. When he was a child, he would give her everything, even a good cricket he caught. During the tomb sweeping day, when people from the city went to the countryside to visit their graves, he would always rush from the front of the village to the back of the village, hiding behind the trees and waiting for them to distribute the rice noodle dumplings to the onlookers. He collected more dumplings than anyone else, enough for the 2 brothers and sisters to eat. In the summer, he caught grasshoppers in the fields, tied them on a long string with a piece of grass, took them home and asked his mother to fry the whole string in oil until they were brown, fragrant and crispy. They have always been poor. He remembered lying in bed in the morning and hearing his mother scooping out rice from the rice vat. The spoon scraped the bottom of the vat and made a small, harsh sound. He could tell that the rice was almost gone. As soon as he heard that sound, he felt a sense of clarity, the bitterness of bones. One day he knew that there was nothing to eat at home. When it was almost time to have lunch, he held his sister's hand and said, "Come out and play, Sister Jinhua." Jinhua was younger than him, and she never knew when she was playing. They played in the fields for a long time. Then he suddenly heard his mother calling out, "Golden roots, golden flowers, why don't you come back for dinner?" He was very surprised. When they returned home, it turned out that she had boiled some beans that she had saved for seeds. The beans are very delicious. His mother sat nearby and smiled, watching them eat. Now that he has grown up and has a field of his own, he does not seem to be suffering silently like before, and there is nothing he can do about it. The younger sister came to him in tears and begged him, but he still had to let her go back empty-handed. He sat on the bench, his knees spread wide apart, his body leaning forward, and one hand groping behind the top of his neck. Yuxiang complained to Jinhua after a lot of complaints. She stood up and walked over to cook. Jin Zhen also stood up and followed. She was bending over to scoop rice into the vat. "I want a good meal today, not a frivolous meal," he whispered to her. "Cook it harder. I want the rice to be counted one by one. I want you to go away quickly. My sister will look weird and under what we are doing here," she said softly, without even looking back. When he returned to Jinhua, she had put away her tears and was playing with a Zhao. She held out Zhao's hand, stood at the door of Gu Gang's room, and looked inside. "I'll wait Potia Zhao, don't you remember? This is my house," she said. "Go to Ao Huluan," Zhao said. "Mom is going to beat you." Pull out what? The Australian overseas Chinese are not even allowed to look at the movie. If you see him eating, Mom will beat you. Adele likes to play with her hand. Then, it was time for lunch. What they ate was still the same thin porridge they ate every day, so thin that it turned blue. Rope-like wild vegetables were cut into sections and floating in it. Jin Zhen was so angry that he couldn't swallow anything in his throat. He ate in silence, then suddenly put down the bowl with a loud sound and walked to the yard to smoke a pipe. It started to snow. The tiny snowflakes were only visible at first when they reflected on the dark mountains. Then gradually, countless gray dots could be seen appearing in the snow-white sky, slowly descending. Jinhua said she had to leave and go back. Yuxiang told her to wait, saying that the snow would not last long, so she should wait until the snow stopped before leaving. But she seemed a little restless. After a while, she stood up to leave again. "Auntie, don't leave if you live here." Zhao pulled her by the skirt of her clothes and refused to let go. Yuxiang said with a smile, "If you don't let my aunt go back, my uncle will come knocking on your door." Jin Zhen took out his big orange umbrella and roughly thrust it into his sister's hand. "Is Australian John Gray used?" When Jinhua said this, she looked not at him, but at her sister-in-law. Yuxiang repeatedly said that they could bring them back if they passed by Zhou Kun at any time. They sent her out onto the road, the two women holding an umbrella together, and Jin Zhen following behind. But before he reached the entrance of the village, he suddenly turned around and went back without saying a word of farewell. The snow soon turned to rain. The snow in Jiangnan is often like this. Yuxiang didn't hold an umbrella when she came back. As soon as she got home, she was busy finding a piece of cloth to dry her clothes and hair, but Jin Zhen had already started yelling at her. "Ao Shen Zhao, let's cook a good meal, that watery rice soup again. If my sister hadn't been here, I would have thrown it in your face. The scars have faded and the palsies have faded, and the scars have faded." My sister Mishi Wang forced her to stop. "It's a rare occasion that I come here once, and I don't even let people eat before I go back. You are so unreasonable. I don't even think about it. She came here specifically to eat better, and people thought we ate so well. We live in such a prosperous life, but if we ask us to borrow money, we have the shame not to borrow a penny." Jin Zhen was silent for a while and finally said, "She won't care about us. If you don't care too much, you can't guarantee that others won't care too much." When she went back and told her man, the whole family knew about it. "Eight won't tell anyone. It's me who rake, and I won't fail to tell you." He had nothing to say. On a rainy afternoon, the room was very dark and closed. The damp cloth shoes gave off a smell. Jin Zhen walked over and fell on the bed. After lying down for a while, he suddenly sat up, rolled up the old patched quilt, put it on his shoulders, stood up and left. "The weather is full of admiration and pride like a swan. Is Zhao Mingxia going away? Pull out the pancreas and stretch it out. Get some wine and eat it." Ao Shen Pang Shuobai grabbed the quilt with all his strength. "It's such a cold day. I'm going to freeze to death. I don't want to live through a life like this when the 8 immortals are defeated." Bai Ji has seen this kind of thing before, like this, for 9 cold days. You have to be a quilt. It would be weird if he froze to death. It's okay if I win money and then redeem the quilt back. Bayo, please spare me, she gasped. She tried her best to pull him here, but she couldn't pull him. She was anxious and angry, with tears streaming down her face. He suddenly loosened his hands one by one and turned away to ignore her, as if he was completely bored. She sat down on the dirt floor with a pop. Then she got up, picked up the quilt, and shook the dust off the quilt while crying. What on earth does he want from me? She thought. We are half starving here, but he wants me to lend her money to help support her husband's family? She told herself this over and over again. Otherwise, you will not be able to rouse your own anger. Because even though she was justified, she didn't know why, but she felt a little ashamed. He seemed very depressed, which made her a little worried. After dinner, she went to bed very soon, wrapping the quilt tightly around Ah Zhao and herself. Later, when Jin Zhen went to bed, he wanted to pull the quilt over and cover himself. But she held on tightly and said, "You don't need to cover me. You are not afraid of the cold." He pulled the quilt hard, almost dragging her and the child to the ground. Then, she was very surprised. He blew out the lamp without making a sound and lay down undressed. It's as if whether the quilt is covered or not is completely ignored. He lay like this and did not fall asleep for a long, long time. He really wanted to turn over and hug her. Since he couldn't drink, he would use her instead, and use that warm body to drown his sorrow. But he himself felt very ashamed because he was poor and useless. He thought of those old jokes about a poor man who pestered his wife when he was hungry, and was ridiculed by his wife. Maybe she would laugh at him too. When it was almost midnight, she knew for sure that he was asleep, so she divided the quilt into half and covered him with it. Then groped in the dark to tuck the quilt tightly into his bed. So he stretched out his arms to hug her in his sleep, out of habit.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.